Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the second chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The text follows. Now comes the question how to influence the probability of success. In the first place, naturally, by the same means which we use when the objective is the subjugation of the enemy, by the destruction of his military force and the conquest of his provinces. But these two means are not exactly of the same import here as they would be in reference to that object. If we attack the enemy's army, it is a very different thing whether we intend to follow up the first blow with a succession of others until the whole force is destroyed, or whether we mean to content ourselves with a victory to shake the enemy's feeling of security, to convince him of our superiority, and to instill into him a feeling of apprehension about the future. If this is our object, we only go so far in the destruction of his forces as is sufficient. In like manner, the conquest of the enemy's provinces is quite a different measure if the object is not the destruction of the enemy's army. In the latter case, the destruction of the army is the real effectual action, and the taking of the provinces only a consequence of it. To take them before the army had been defeated would always be looked upon as a necessary evil. On the other hand, if our views are not directed upon the complete destruction of the enemy's force, and if we are sure that the enemy does not seek but fears to bring matters to a bloody decision, the taking possession of a weak or defenseless province is an advantage in itself, and if this advantage is of sufficient importance to make the enemy apprehensive about the general result, then it may also be regarded as a shorter road to peace. But now we come upon a peculiar means of influencing the probability of the result without destroying the enemy's army, namely upon the expeditions which have a direct connection with political views. If there are any enterprises which are particularly likely to break up the enemy's alliances or make them inoperative, to gain new alliances for ourselves, to raise political powers in our favor, etc., etc., then it is easy to conceive how much this may increase the probability of success and become a shorter way towards our object than the routing of the enemy's forces. So, here von Clausewitz tells us how to increase our chances of success against the enemy. So, in the first place, were we to use the same means which we use normally when the object is the subjugation of the enemy, therefore by the destruction of his military force and the conquest of his provinces, we have to take into consideration that these two means are not exactly of the same import. Here, especially as they would be in reference to that specific object, right? That is the subjugation of the enemy. So, 1. If we attack the enemy's army, it is a very different thing whether we intend to follow up the first blow with a succession of others until the whole force is destroyed, or whether we mean to content ourselves with a victory to shake the enemy's feeling of security, right? To convince him of our superiority or to instill into him a feeling of apprehension about the future. This is particularly important because you realize that there are very different forces entailed given the same enemy, depending on what our object is. We can think of crushing him, literally, so wiping out his entire army, right? Even in there, we could see, whether we can achieve that with the least blows as possible, so impressing a greater force, as it would be abstractly our objective if we were not to take into consideration other relative factors around. Otherwise, we can, as it happens most of the times, to inflict several blows on the enemy until the whole force is destroyed, is annihilated. Just remembering then here, by destruction, we don't mean the necessarily the complete physical annihilation of the enemy. That is slaughtering all of his armored forces. Here, we have to destroy the armored forces. So it can pass through many things. It can be physical, but it's as well, but it's always physical and moral at the same time, right? And all we have to do is to render in that case, the enemy forces inoffensive, right? To basically make them out of use in some way, to knock them out. Otherwise, there is this other path that is, historically the most frequent in terms of mere statistics. That is the shock of the enemy's feelings, right? The sense of security, as von Clausewitz calls it, to prove that basically we are the strongest ones, right? And they can't do much against us, so prospecting them many terrible things in the future. Naturally, given this frame of options, it's very hard in every war that this doesn't basically correspond to some sort of risk or that we can't easily see how it's gonna go before. Here we're talking about the object, so what we can we aim hopefully to achieve, and then how this happens is wholly another matter. So here von Clausewitz, I wouldn't say it's still in the complete realm of theory, but it's still presenting us with certain general elements of warfare and how the mechanism works, without yet entering into the actual detail. But this is paradoxically more important because it still clarifies from the fundamentals, right? From the essentials, what we're talking about and what we always have to take into consideration. Because at the end of the day, von Clausewitz is going from the most general to the more into depth towards the more complex, right? So it's something that, even though it can sound obviously theoretical and obviously absolutely modifiable by the serious events, it's still what dominates the whole as a mechanism, as a dynamic, the whole system. So even if you descend obviously in the practice of warfare in something more detailed, still this is the general frame, with the general boundaries within which you act, right? So von Clausewitz says, given that this is our object, so we want really to subjugate the enemy, we only go so far in the destruction of his forces as is sufficient. So we need to subjugate the enemy, fine. At this point, we want to destroy his forces. We can't go like that. Then he says, in like manner, the conquest of the enemy's provinces is quite a different measure, if the object is not the destruction of the enemy's army. In the latter case, the destruction of the army is the real effectual action, and the taking of the provinces only a consequence of it. To take them before the army had been defeated would always be the provinces would always be looked upon as a necessary evil, right? Because seizing a province in the whole process is not kind of an easy affair. You can obviously access resources. If you occupy one province, you seize it and control it, but controlling it even has to do with increasing the dispersion of your forces, for example, that are the ones you're using to subjugate the enemy army, and therefore occupying space with a country will absorb resources from useful resources from. So that can be particularly problematic sometimes, right? So that it's pretty. There are many examples in history of you can seize an enemy territory sometimes. Maybe it's even the most resourceful, the richest one, the one that by seizing will make a lot of damage to the enemy, but still the enemy could retreat somewhere else to get stronger, militarily speaking, at least from that position. And at a certain point also you have to either remain there with the army, so you permanently occupy there and you try to remain there like a shield, or either you have to retreat. Think about the Romans against the Parthians and the Sassanids. The wealthiest places that the Romans also wanted to conquer were just like Mesopotamia, right? But once they conquered it, they realized they couldn't hold it for long, because from the Iranian plateau, the Persians could keep invading there, and it was a kind of a problem. And in that case, there were many other factors that were rendering more problematic for the Romans to finally crush the whole Persian bloc, even if they maybe crushed their political integrity at that point with sacking their capital and all this stuff, but still, it's still a problem to maintain those lands. So what does Trajan do? Well, he backs up, he goes away, he abandons Mesopotamia. So that's kind of a random example, but can serve to make you understand maybe this specific one, not specifically, but the idea that by advancing into a territory, you have to invest resources even to maintain it. Well, if your main problem there is to annihilate the enemy army, well, that detracts resources, right? So Von Clausewitz says, on the other hand, if our views are not directed upon the complete destruction of the enemy's force, and if we are sure that the enemy does not seek but fears to bring matters to a bloody decision, the taking possession of a weak or defenseless province is an advantage in itself, and if this advantage is of sufficient importance to make the enemy apprehensive about a general result, then it may also be regarded as a shorter road to peace, right? So this is also particularly important, right? He says, if what you are seeking is not the, as most of the time, here he doesn't add that, but it's kind of implicit. As most of the times, we don't really need to. And here we're talking about the Caesar of a province, right? But this can be extended in many other ways that even enter into the political realm, as we will see at the end of this passage, because you don't need sometimes to annihilate the enemy forces to reach the objective that you had in mind. If your object is directed to just make the enemy fulfill your will, reaching those peace conditions that you have set, sometimes even occupying a province can shake the enemy at the point of saying, okay, this guy has invaded one of my provinces, he got them so easily, right? And this can happen at in all ranges of dimension. Take the Eastern Front of World War II. What the Axis accomplished on the Eastern Front was taking like an enormous amount of land to the Soviets. That was initially quite a big deal. And in fact, the main thing was to try to convince the Soviets to capitulate at one point, because if they had crossed a certain line, the entire situation would have been seriously hopeless. Like if they had marched on Moscow, or this was three cities, either Leningrad, then Moscow, or Stalingrad. Well, that was the line beyond which the Soviets had redeployed all of their facilities, infrastructure, and industrial production. At that point, having even surpassed that boundary, even without having maybe annihilated still the bulk of the Soviet divisions, the whole thing would have been increasingly difficult. I mean, probably the Soviets would have given up, right? It didn't happen. Because of many reasons, actually, that we'll have to discuss sooner or later, but that was a perfectly good example of how the Blitzkrieg, for instance, from a strategical point of view, was designed to say, okay, we even give you this shock of saying, look at how much these guys can conquer in one shot. It has definitely its problems, because in that case, like in many others, it overstretched the supply lines. It's kind of a problem to logistically resupply and control these spaces, and also because of the resistance behind the back at your back and all that stuff. But it still has a pretty imposing effect on the world, on the enemy. In that case specifically, it was also something kind of propagandistic. I mean, this swift advance against an enemy that was depicted as corrupted, evil, kind of inferior, and that couldn't stand the might of the Axis forces. Well, it was part of the moral. Right, it was part of definitely strengthening even the Axis morale, but even kind of trying to destroy the Soviet one. And obviously, it wasn't just about this. Evidently, you can argue that especially in such complex scenarios, everything is way more. It's very complicated, but still, these dynamics are to be found. You know, similarly in many ways, if not in all of them, many circumstances, if not in all of them, because they all war is aimed both at a physical and at a moral objective at the end of the day. There can be, an overwhelming prevalence of one of the two over the other, but it's never to eliminate the other, the other effectively. So if what you want is just to shake the enemy at the point of saying, okay, I give up, even if I have my army still standing, I don't want to go on because things can get seriously worse at that point for many reasons, right? Either because they realized they couldn't defend those provinces, or maybe because those provinces were particularly productive, right? And this is particularly important also for another reason, that obviously seen it from the attacker's perspective, there is a big deal of problem naturally, even for controlling these lands. I mean, it's not so dramatically difficult, but the worst is even from, and obviously from the defender's side, because of that difference in potential that we have talked now a lot of times between attack and defense, right? So that when you are attacked and you defend, naturally you have an edge, on average, which doesn't mean that you have an edge every time you defend over the enemy. It's not like that. You can be overwhelmingly inferior so that you can't even put up a fight. But the problem at that point is also that if you manage to stop the enemy and you have lost a lot of ground, what you have to do is to pass to counterattack. And always with example of the Eastern Front during World War II, the Soviets knew how much it costed to kick out the Nazis out of their land. I mean, if the Germans beated them pretty harshly when they were in attack, so where they were from, let's say the difficult side, you can imagine now how bloody it was to when it dealt with, when they were in defense. So trying to maintain now the territories that they had conquered. And that was an enormous cost in terms of human lives. You're talking about millions of people who were literally thrown into the meat grinder just to dislodge the Germans from there with an enormous amount of losses. And that was played, politically speaking, because as I was recalling, I think in the last video, that 1943 was a moment in which, even the Soviets and the Nazis looked at each other and said, what hell do we do now? Like, these major offensives being stopped, but now the Soviets have to fight it all back. So what do we do? They went relatively close to peace at that point, to say, okay, let's spare us from this bloodshed. Instead, the Soviets chose to press on, and obviously for their own benefit, because eventually they seized what they managed to seize, but with enormous loss. In 1944, with the Operation Bagration, and all that stuff, the Soviets lost a huge amount of people, of quantity of human lives, of soldiers who were fighting the Germans in attack, and that was a moment in which even Stavka said, okay, let's try to overthrow Stalin. And bear in mind, Stalin at that point was at the peak of its power. So that tells you so much how even seizing a province is something so sometimes so difficult to reverse from the other side, and that it poses many problems, because theory is that most of the times, at least for the loss of those provinces, the one who has lost those is weaker, right? It controls less land, so on average less resources. It can as well happen that maybe has lost a region that where there's nothing valuable. That's also some. Maybe it even wanted him time to reorganize while the enemy was advancing into that wasteland. But most of the times it's not really the case, and in fact that's something also the attacker would take into consideration, what he attacked at land for. I mean, so these are all strategical factors that enter into play and that are meant to make a lot of difference. And naturally also over the table of negotiations for peace at the end of the day, right? So it's very important to consider this. That now, von Clausewitz will be way more, way more explicit somewhere else. But for now, he's setting this trends now. So then he says, but now. So okay, well, I think this last concept was generally clear. So he said, if this advantage is of sufficient importance to make the enemy apprehensive about the general result, then it may also be regarded as a short road to peace, right? So that's something you have to evaluate. Always remember, for now, von Clausewitz is not talking about absolutes. He's talking about absolutes in the theoretical field, but it's still all relative to what the circumstances are. Always bear it in mind. It's particularly important. Then he says, but now we come upon a peculiar means of influencing the probability of the result without destroying the enemy's army, namely upon the expeditions which have a direct connection with political views. So now he observes how you can annihilate an enemy's army. So from the classical, let's say, abstract, objective point of view of war, but achievable, let's say, that is achievable without a merely military intervention. And this is perhaps also kind of even more important, right? Excuse me, I drink a little before we go on. And then he says, if there are any enterprises which are particularly likely to break up the enemy's alliances or make them inoperative, to gain new alliances for ourselves, to raise political powers in our own favor, etc., etc., then it is easy to conceive how much these may increase, the probability of success and become a shorter way towards our object than the routing of the enemy's forces, right? So, in other words, there is not just war. And this is the same old story. War is, and I will repeat this to the nausea, war is nothing but a political instrument and an act of policy. War doesn't work by itself. It's an instrument. It's like a tool, right? That's what you use because you have something in your mind. The military is just a mere instrument, nothing else. And that's what it's conceived to be existentially, let's say. And there is no other way. And what it is, as a matter of fact, right? Because we have observed how it is a real instrument. So the whole point here gets to achieving certain political goals that can reduce the effectiveness of the enemy's army, right? So the military resistance of the enemy. So it can be, here there is this list, either breaking up the enemy's alliances, that's pretty clear. You get rid of other powers that can intervene in favor of your enemy so that he's remaining alone against you. Or make them inoperative. So this is also important. You may not actually break an alliance, but you can make it impossible to exist, right? Or you can make the same enemy inoperative in some way. You can tie his hands in some other way. You can gain new alliances for yourself. Here's ourselves, and therefore increase your own ability to deliver violence, to deliver an act of force over the enemy, or to raise political powers in your own favor. This is particularly important, to raise political powers. What are political powers here? It's really vague, and that's what really political powers are, because it can be a political power within the enemy, the enemy's country. Can be some external political power that maybe has to do with, I don't know, economical policies for which it doesn't export weapons to your enemy's country, for instance, anymore. Or maybe it's even a political power within your own country, that is a fringe of your population that believes certain things and maybe is pro-war against that country, and so on, right? So there can be countless examples of this. It's never, and that's the range in which you should be able to move at all times and beyond, actually, if you want to annihilate one enemy. Because here Von Clausewitz is showing us on the broader range what war originates from, where those relations of strength that we were talking about before are basically subdued to these other factors. They're dependent on them, essentially. So there is no need to recur to violence to kill a freaking lot of people. This is the truth. You can't even starve them to death. Look what the Soviets did to the Ukrainians in the 30s of the 20th century. It's convenient, right? You can do this pretty easily, so that you say, well, I didn't use force, I didn't kill anyone. Well, in that case, obviously there was even some kind of an act of killing, but it's like the idea of the right war, of the just war. No? I didn't shoot first, I didn't do it, but yeah, maybe you did something that caused a freaking mess, including maybe sometimes this can happen by non-intervening. This is, you have to think, this is really even what you have to bear in terms of responsibilities, politically speaking. Think about all the effort that was done, in the late 1930s to appease Hitler, and that Czechoslovakia was occupied, and that was celebrated like the great accomplishment of Lord Chamberlain's to have achieved peace. Peace, we will have so many, another century of peace in Europe, you're so happy, and so on. See what happens after a while. So even that mistake maybe was done in full, I don't know how much, frankly, but let's say ideally, for the sake of example, for let's say a just cause, it caused 50 million dead, right? And at that time, Hitler could be easily stopped. That's really the real side of the story. Naturally, the situation is a bit more complicated than this, but at that point, it was realistic to operate differently and to prevent certain things to happen. That time was written nowhere that Hitler would have succeeded in what he wanted to accomplish. Even the campaigns of Poland and France, contrarily was commonly believed, were actually a very lucky shot from the German side. At that time, was absolutely not prepared as any other army in the world at that time for that type of conflict. But that's why even in that case you realize that everything was played politically in a way also, and not just militarily speaking, for which eventually Nazi Germany succeeded in football. So I make these examples because I think they give you a better dimension of how than just the theoretical dictatum would present you with, because it really tells you how really these things happen, not just every once in a while. Here, von Clausewitz is not talking about one thing that happened once, so I heard of it or I thought of it. Here it is how it happens, plain and simple, all the time, by definition, right? So it's important to conjugate this theory also with practice, right? So um, in fact, he writes, then it is easy to conceive how much all these elements that we have listed may increase the probability of success and become a shorter way towards our object than the routing of the enemy's forces. Here he makes it very explicit. You can do that, you can achieve that goal, politically speaking, without seeing the enemies running. The enemy's armies run, right? So, because you didn't need to pull the trigger, to fire a shot, and all because you acted politically. If you have the opportunities to do it, and that comes kind of always before, because that's what the whole story is about, that in order for policy to resort to a military instrument, well, policy must have a good reason to do that. Has to have a rational intention, right, for calculating when the military instrument is to be used and when not. And yet, all of this can also lead to disaster anyway. So that you don't here, von Clausewitz is listing the examples, taking, let's say, you from one perspective, that is the one of the guy who wins at the end, right? But it's never so simple, as we will be seeing now. That's why I insist so much on the difference between the theory and the practice here, from the let's say, from the importance of the two that, however, can't exist without one another. So it's obvious that even behaving with all this care, you may not achieve one result, or maybe you achieve it, but fundamentally you're not able to exploit it, you're not able to use it properly. And this is very a big problem, right? And it doesn't stop to just saying, okay, well, I will follow this as a manual. It's never to be followed like a manual. It's like a brainstorming, right? You make a list of all the stuff that can be useful for you or that can be harmful, and you try to not really to think to make it to draw an equation from there and say, okay, got the answer, but just to make you have clear in mind at least what your options are. Then it's up to you to figure out which one will work best, and believe me, it's incredibly difficult. It's not like, in fact, solving just like a problem, it's something that in which basically nobody has the answer. And that's why von Clausewitz insists rightfully on the fact that there is no science of war. Whoever thinks that there is a science of war is a madman. There is just a military art that is essentially figuring out how to achieve something, just by trying, but obviously trying with a discipline, with an intelligence, with an ability to look through things that can exist, by the way, only if you make practice. That's why it's an art in the etymologically, in the Latin etymology of the term. That is, this activity that is also very material. It's very very practical in itself, but still requires intelligence. It needs you to be clever and to do things that work, not just that you think that kind of sound good or that you can guess. At the end of the day, you always have to guess. We have seen how you can't calculate everything, but not even the majority. You always have to rely on calculation of probabilities. What von Clausewitz says is that there is still an awareness, a general experience of the military art can derive from practice and from theory, which means from actual command of an army and the studying of military history. That is what can tell you more or less how likely something to happen really is, right? This is also kind of interesting because it's as if there was an average at the end of the day, and this average is hidden into the pages of military history in some way, and it's difficult to assess because it's very plastic, like a metaphor. We know obviously military history, but we up to a certain point. Just we know history. Let's say, what's the truth? Because this is what it gets down to. What's the truth? You can't know that. You can't know that in a certain time, certain place, two armies clashed. There was this kind of tactics involved, maybe some factors, but can you tell how it really went? Were you there? Do you know how many factors? For most of ancient medieval battle, but even modern contemporary ones, we don't actually know how it went. Do you think that history is real? I mean, that you open a history book and that you find what is written in there, it's really what happens. You're lucky if it's true at a 70%. You're very lucky. For the rest, we don't really know, but we can at least trace a synthesis that naturally, the more generic it gets, kind of the more accurate it can be, but at the same time in itself, but it can also not get into the minutiae, let's say, that it's that are required even to take certain decisions on the field, etc. And therefore everything revolves around adding experience to your craft. That is what the military art is all about, right? So exercising, it's like playing a game many times and knowing how it can go, how it doesn't go, but always being aware that and in any game you don't have a solution for winning all the time, right? Especially if you have this probabilistic setting, and especially if you are playing also against someone else, right? So war is not like in video games. I don't know whether fortunately or unfortunately enough, but it's evident that even the degree of simulation involved maybe in certain of these things, they show you the essentially the game of the story. If you this is interesting even for understanding the Clausewitzian trinity, that the reason why we like games is really that we are attracted from the unknown. It's like throwing the dice. I mean, sometimes aside from the fact that I usually pick random topics by throwing the dice, right? But sometimes, if I have a dice, here I have it, and I throw it, it's always cool to say which number will turn out, and then you play it over again. Let's say I expect now to exit 2. No, it turned out to be 3. But yeah, isn't it thrilling? Isn't it something you say, wow, this is kind of cool, let's make a game about that? I know it's banal and dumb, but it's really what a set of probabilities is all about. And in a system that is so complex like war, the result is really unpredictable. Always remember that for von Clausewitz, and therefore in reality, war is the human activity that basically entails the larger degree of unpredictability into the world system, right? Because there is, and this is important. The enemy is not passive, so it's not, and that's just one of the variables actually. But I don't know why, but it shows you that there is someone that is going against you at the same time, right? So that's why we're thrilled by war, and that's why war is interesting. We like to learn about it, because it's as if, let's see who wins. I mean, to make it very banal, but it's even beyond that. It's kind of a existential metaphor. It's like, let's look at how we can commit our very best to achieve something so important, right? That's where the myth of heroism comes from, where the grandeur, the propaganda that attracts, in fact, many people even into the study of history in general, military history. But then it has to be refined. It has to be understood as the product of a reality that is evidently has nothing to do with propaganda and all this stuff. But it has to do with the harsh acknowledgement that nobody can predict how a war will end. Nobody. And there can be naturally better, or let's say more or less accurate, let's say, expectations, and but it's still something that goes far beyond that. And that's why strategical studies, not just because the actual importance of the matter of war in general, but why strategical studies are so complex. Because in order to understand how a war really works, you have really to study for years of your own life. Let's be honest about this. I mean, what do you think that a person that has no knowledge whatsoever what's going on can have a minimal grasp of things that are debated kind of daily, like things like wars, conflicts, and all this stuff? Nothing. And that's why we have strategical analysts that sometimes they really suck, especially the ones that share the stuff on the internet, and then apparently they know everything about everything, and it turns out just by reading the first lines of their articles that they know nothing. That may probably better than them, actually, because they say certain banal things that you realize everything gets down to like 2 or 3 factors, and you say, man, this is a war. It has massive implications. You can't get it down to that. Obviously, there is also an ability of synthesis, but you can't be so overly confident. That's what the history of mankind tells us, that we are very easily, we can get fooled very easily to pretend we know how it's gonna go. And it turns out it's also one of the best recipes for political and as a consequence military disasters that happen all the time when there is this underestimation, or at least this lowering of the guard and this ability of looking through things. And there are historically many examples of this. Even there are certain traditions. Think about, let's not digress into this now, but there are certain political entities, etc., that are very advanced, and they kind of rely on that too much by saying, okay, well, I'm superior to anyone else. Very often this is a kind of even an intellectual superiority, right? A certain knowledge, a certain awareness. This is typical even of powers that think that I've seen it all before, like we've been in so many wars and now we will know how it is. But most of the times the enemy is always a step ahead in some ways, and everything is about doctrine. That is, you can't say, I'm strongest, therefore I will win. Turns out in war it really doesn't work like that. It doesn't on a general base. And it can in part, but it's minority. By norm, wars are won by intelligence, not by strength. And we keep falling into the same mistake at the end of the day. Why? Is it because no, because we instinctively kind of lean towards the the simplest idea. I'm stronger, therefore I will smash you. And that's what if you don't sharpen your mind, that's a very pretty eloquent sign that your mind has kind of shrank in terms of analytical intelligence in general, critical abilities, right? And that's why even if you want to understand if a person understands something about military history, or you say the easiest thing to do is seeing how confident that person is. I mean, or maybe really not, because there are obviously people who are very confident because they actually know their business and they get it right? But let's say this ability of saying, it's simply as that, right? When you don't get straight answers, in the sense that it may be because you don't understand really the type of answer, then maybe it's trying to make you reflect on the broader issue, on the broader problem. It's very difficult, especially if in such fields like polemology, to start really, and it's normal because it's really an intellectual process of structuration, if you want, of that brings you to makes you start from a few pieces, a few elements, right? Because you think that that's what it has all to do with, and then the more you go on, the more you realize that maybe those elements are kind of positive, they help you to understand the thing, but that still there is a large amount of unknown. And sometimes it's still disappointing. It's kind of disappointing because you say, but is it possible that it's really so impossible to know so many things, and that somehow not just war but life in general is about simply going out there and trying without know whether succeeding or not? Well, I would say sadly, but fortunately, it is so. Because if it wasn't so, we wouldn't be, first of all, what we are, but we would also cease to be what we are, because we are programmed by nature to get into the unknown. So that's where this terrible attraction towards war comes from, because it's a game. It's like throwing the dice. And you want to be into it, because it turns out human mind is attracted by chaos. It's attracted by problems to sort out. That's why you can't even be, let's say, the wealthiest person in the world to have literally everything. But still you will search for something kind of to not to ruin it all awfully, but still at least to get you to do something. Because humans need to be committed into something. And this is interesting because it could open to many other considerations about what seems to be to this day a pretty serious social problem around which most of our war is revolved. That is the lack of purpose. We have lack of purpose. We indulge even in extremism, in radicalism, and all this stuff because we stopped reasoning. So we start behaving way more like the apes that we really are at the end of the day, but without making use of what distinguishes ourselves from the other species. That is this very great ability to abstract, to think things through rationally, and to go beyond and to make a step that goes forward, even beyond, not really beyond reality, but at least beyond what is just apparent in front of you. And that's how even science progressed, actually, in its path. Sometimes it's just a trick. Sometimes it's really a matter of, in fact, not really concentrating on everything, but just concentrating on that thing that works, because but then you have to restart. You have to stay awake. You have to realize that how you got at one point, and you have to get to the next one, and you have to take lots of other things into consideration. So, at least this is particularly, we're still in the first book. That is, we will see now. We're reading these chapters. They're not particularly long, telling the truth, but they're still meaningful and important. Very meaningful, important, because they set the trends, set the base, and then we'll get into. Here we're still talking. Just remember, this is the first book that is about the essence of war. We're talking about the essence. We're not talking about now not even about the theory proper of war, right? We will get it into the next book. Then there will be the strategy and the analysis of the fight, of the fighting forces, of the defense, of the offense, and the war plan, etc. But this is a fantastic. The Clausewitzian one is really a fantastic journey, and it's very important to be undertaken, to leave it, because it tells us so much even about ourselves, not just only about war. War is somehow the most impressive and devastating symbol of our need for chaos, right? But here, on these words, they're starting to sound a bit too presumptuous, I will stop my video, and we will get on next time. So, Okay, so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.